Today's 29 November. Tomorrow is the last day in November. We are only 2 days away from beginning the great last month of the year, the month of December. December. It's an interesting month. December means a lot of things for a lot of people. What does December mean for you? I read this past week in preparation for my sermons I preached before on this day. I read articles, some of them current, some of them past. I came across one that bothered me in 1985. I kept it. Bothered me then, bothers me now. How old were you? 1985. Where were you then? December, said this newspaper article, is the month of tarnished dreams for so many people. The year that was brightly begun in hope finally comes to the last month with the most of the dreams dashed to pieces. Businesses have struggled this past year, and they failed. Marriages have ended. Loved ones have been buried. Children have rebelled against and disappointed mom and dad have let down children. Illnesses come, they hit, they run. They leave weaknesses, low spirits. Temptations have taken their toll during the year. The year that was brightly begun in January comes now beaten and weary to December. Maybe that's why Advent is so needed for the final month of the year. It is interesting that the Christian year begins at the end of the calendar year. Remarkable. The Christian year is based on Easter. It moves back from Easter and counts 40 days, Ash Wednesday, the beginning of Lent. It moves backward into the season of Epiphany to January the 6th, the day for the manifestation of Christ to the world. And the 4 Sundays before Epiphany Day begin the season of Advent. Advent begins the gospel readings not with the birth of Jesus, but toward the end of his ministry. And when you get to the passage in Luke, it is amazing. There's not a thing here about Christmas. George Bass said the first Sunday in the Christian year, the first Sunday of Advent, ought to be called Wake Up Sunday, because it shouts to all the world in the midst of its busy life, wake up, wake up. Are you aware of what time it is? It's an amazing thing. The gospel year begins not by telling us about baby Jesus and Christmas. The mall has been telling us about Christmas for 2 months now. But the gospel of the year begins marking your life at the end of Jesus' ministry. The Christian year begins with a shout for all the world to hear that Jesus Christ, the Lord of heaven and earth, will come again. Time is timed. Time began, physicists tell us, about 15 billion years ago, give or take a year or two. The Big Bang ushered in what is known as the space-time continuum. In physics, there was, before that event, no such thing as time. Time began 15 billion years ago. And those same physicists tell us that time will end. The space-time continuum as we know it will close. Aristotle said life is like a story. It has a beginning, a middle, and it has an end. And the Christian story reminds you and me that we are born into time and that time is passing. Before ever the mountains were, says Scripture, God was. God, the uncreated source of all that is, was and always will be. And this particular gospel lesson speaks to us in the middle of our busy preparations for Christmas and asks you, what time is it in your life? The Christian year begins with a shout that Jesus Christ will come again. The first Sunday of the year is the first Sunday in Advent. December will begin in 2 days, the month of tarnished dreams. And yet you and I come to church on this Advent morning, and we are blasted out of our pews with a strange passage of Scripture about signs in the sun and the moon and the roaring seas, the heavens and the earth being shaken, and the Son of Man, a strange figure that you read about in Daniel chapter 7, is riding on the clouds of time. All of that language is known in theological terms as apocalyptic language. Apocalyptic is an adjective that comes from the noun apocalypse, like apocalypse now. The book of Revelation, its title in Greek is Apocalypsis. The book of Revelation is an apocalypse. Apocalyptic language is all through the Bible. It jumps out of the pages at you. The passage that I read to you, you will find pieces of it in Psalms, in Isaiah. You'll find part of it in the book of Daniel, some of it in the prophet Zephaniah. You will find pieces of that language now in Jesus' mouth toward the end of his ministry on this earth. Apocalypse means revelation, revealing something that has been hidden before. Apocalyptic literature is, quite frankly, fascinating literature. It's weird stuff. Its message comes in coded images and symbols, and it speaks like poetry. It's the kind of language that tells us something that is too much, really, for mainline American religion. Because in most Christian churches in this country today, apocalyptic language comes across as being rather irrelevant. The apocalyptic message that you find in the Scriptures that speak to us on the first Sunday of Advent is the fantastic news that Jesus Christ will come again. When these things take place, says Jesus, stand up, raise your heads. Your redemption is near. Apocalyptic language is not heard often around here. Oh, it's heard. You hear a lot of it on television from those preachers who are talking to you about when the world will end, and they're talking to you about your money being their money. Apocalyptic language, says one great theologian, is not heard so much in the mainline churches anymore because in the mainline churches we've traded apocalyptic poetry for therapeutic advice. The same author says, for this reason we're unable to speak either to great pain or to great fear. The line between Sunday sermons and the advice column in the morning newspapers has grown very thin. The lessening of apocalyptic is always a signal for the adjustment of the church to the needs of the petty bourgeois world in which you live. and adjustment to the anxieties common to all. Today, you can learn more about the justice of the oppressed, the deep pain of the poor, and the average middle-class misery in the world by going to the theater than by listening to the average sermon. Art and apocalyptic go together. What do you do with language like this in Luke's gospel? We're uncomfortable with such speak, really. People who run banks, people who work in universities, people who lead armies and navies, people who have profited from the status quo, those people twitch when they hear language like this. But for the people who are on the bottom of society, the small, the poor, and those who have little gain in the preservation of things as they are, those people tremble with delight when they hear the Bible talk about what, by God's grace, might come to be. Where were you in 1865? Well, I wasn't here. I'm as old as dirt, but I wasn't here then. Precisely. In 1865, Mary Chestnut wrote Diary of a March, 1865. This is what she said, quote, Sherman, that would be General Sherman. Sherman marched off in a solid column this morning, leaving not so much as a blade of grass behind. A howling wilderness, a land laid waste, dust and ashes in the wind. The end of the Old South. Now, Mary Chestnut wrote eloquently, hauntingly about something that happened not all that long ago. But she did not write from the perspective of the slaves. Because when Mary Chestnut wrote about Sherman marching off in a single column, she failed to mention in her tale of devastation and woe that the slaves were dancing in the streets of Columbia, South Carolina. It all depends where you're standing, how you react to apocalyptic news. How shall we deal with a month of tarnished dreams? Is there anything in this weird picture language, apocalyptic, that Jesus might be trying to speak to us through? How do you deal with stress? Do you meditate? Do you do breathing exercises? In the middle of that Auburn game yesterday, I was doing my breathing exercises. Do you take a walk in the woods? Maybe you take a stroll by the Gulf. Do you punch a mattress with your fists until you feel better? All of these things were suggested and have been repeatedly suggested by physicians in radio programs that deal with stress, how you get over it, how you live with it. The stress expert goes on to say, however, if you are caught in a bad marriage, if you've lost your job, or if you're living with cancer, some of these techniques that I've advertised here might not be helpful. We can ease some of the symptoms of stress, not its causes. Yesterday, before Michigan played Ohio State, there was a heart-touching piece about a little boy who just died, a 5-year-old child born to a Michigan Wolverine family. The family is famous in Michigan lore. The father was a great football player, the grandfather the coach. This little baby was born into a dream land. As the mother said, "You're born a Wolverine in this house." But at age 5, this little boy fell and broke his nose. They took him to the doctor, and on the way from the doctor's home or the doctor's office to their home, the mother said she began to recount to herself that their little 5-year-old boy had fallen a lot in recent days. They took him back to the physician. He was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer that afflicts children. The mother said something that just gave pause to the rest of the day. She said, "When they told us that our son was terminally ill and there was nothing that we could do, everything changed." Sometimes the things that you do to deal with life, they just don't quite get it. Could it be that most of what passes for cure these days is merely temporary relief? We have a pill for the pain, but the cause of the illness, that's beyond us. Monica Helwig said something once: "If it won't play in a cancer ward or in a shoddy nursing home for the elderly, then whatever it is, it's not the gospel of Jesus Christ." If it won't play in a cancer ward or in a shoddy home for the elderly, then whatever it is not the gospel of the Lord. In other words, the gospel of the Lord plays really well in a cancer ward, in a shoddy home for the elderly. Part of the gospel message, Jesus Christ is Lord, is that Jesus Christ the Lord is coming again. Is that good news for you or bad news? I suppose it depends on where you're standing when you hear that news. Bad news if you're weighed down in drunkenness and dissipation and the worry of this current little tawdry age in which we're living. It's bad news for you if your big concern this morning is about what you're going to give and get for Christmas. Lord God, you need to get a life. But it is good news if you are standing on your tiptoes, ready and waiting for nothing less than your redemption. Where are you standing? How does that news sound to you? David Buttrick is a dean of preachers. He's taught up at Vanderbilt for years. David Buttrick tells the story of an old black woman who lived deep in the bayous of Louisiana. She raised over a dozen children. Most of those kids she adopted. They were foster children. When a newspaper reporter asked that old woman who was poor why she would raise so many children, she said, "'Cause I saw a new world coming." What we're talking about this morning is not a private experience in your heart. My teacher, Fred Craddock, died last year. Fred Craddock was one of the greatest preachers of the 20th century. He taught for some time at Vanderbilt before he came to Emory. Fred Craddock one time said, "The coming of the Son of Man cannot properly be described in terms of private religious experience. You see, the human heart is just too small a screen on which to cast such a grand scene. For all that Christian faith means to each individual who embraces that faith, the church cannot continue to permit, much less endorse, a subjective captivity of the gospel. Not even within the community of faith is it adequate for the arena of Christ's work. You see, the whole creation is the subject. The whole creation is the object of Christ's redemption. The whole of the cosmos stands at the door, eagerly listening for the redemption of the children of God. Paul wrote that. The final changes in heaven and earth are not to usher in a time of terror for the faithful. They are to enable the faithful to realize that these are the signs of their own redemption. That old black woman, in what she said, "I saw a new world coming," said exactly what Fred Craddock said a little more eloquently at Vanderbilt. But the truth is, most of us have reduced our religion to the merely moral, the merely therapeutic. We've not so much what God offers, we have a lot of what the world offers. In fact, we have so much of what the world offers to us that we don't need a redemption that's cosmic in its dimensions. Flannery O'Connor, in one of her haunting tales, has a character say, "A man don't need redemption if he's got a good car." We have a lot and we want more. And the truth is, we have reduced Jesus. Jesus, especially this time of year, is the sweet little baby who wants to get lots of gifts at Christmas. Or maybe we reduce Jesus by saying, well, he was a great teacher, and thereby reducing all the things he said to some noble idea. A reduced Jesus is good for most of life's hassles, but a reduced Jesus, the kind you carry around in your heart, a reduced Jesus is not too good for the bigger hassles that life has to offer. So, if you can't be helped by a pill or a noble, uplifting idea or a call to put more effort into what you're doing, this text is speaking to you. The truth is, some Sundays we just don't need all that much religion, do we? There are 52 Sundays in a year, and most of those Sundays just hunky-dory, thank you very kindly. We don't need a whole lot of, religion. But there are some Sundays when you just can't be comforted with anything less than the redemption that Christ offers. Listen to this story. There was this man lived next door to the church where I pastored. His yard was always a mess, embarrassed the people of the church. His children were poorly cared for, and there were rumors he got drunk on Saturdays, abused his wife, cursed his children. So our church decided we'd help that man. I personally visited his house. Some of the youth went by and invited his kids to go with him on their annual trek to the mountains. And the women's group that meets in the refectory next door asked the woman to join them for the annual day of prayer. The man and his family came for a few Sundays, and then they quit. And that was the last time I heard of that man until a few months later, I met him on the street. At first, I didn't know him. He looked different. I said, "Joe, is that you?" "Yeah, it's me," he said, and he laughed. "At least it's mostly me. I've changed." I could see that he was different. His whole physical appearance had changed. Joe looked great. Come to think of it, Joe's yard had changed. It looked great. What had happened to Joe? He told me that a few weeks before, a group had come by his house to pray for him. They'd heard he'd been on another binge. It was a church group, but it was not a church group from our nice, middle-class Methodist church. It was a church group from a fundamentalist church, the one across the tracks, the premillennial, fire-baptized, Bible-believing, washed in the blood of Jesus Baptist church. And they told Joe that if he didn't stop drinking and beating his wife, he was going to die and burn in hell forever. They told him God was coming to get him. And God was mad at that kind of crappy behavior. They got Joe's attention. They got him to their church where they prayed for him. They called his name out loud. They laid their hands on him. And they asked God to let him live a little longer till they could get him saved. And Joe got saved. Turned inside out, upside down. Joe said to me, "I've been redeemed." I said something about how sorry I was that our church had been unable to meet Joe's needs. But I was happy that he'd found a church that could. Joe looked at me and he said, "Preacher, don't feel bad. Your church gave me an aspirin. I needed massive chemotherapy." And then we gathered with Jesus in an upper room for a meal, a nice meal. Jesus with his friends. Little food, little polite conversation. And when we all were settled down at the table, Jesus said, "That cup is my blood. And that bread is my body, broken in pieces for you." I guess if we are to be redeemed, if God comes to redeem us, redemption will not be cheap. Religion is therapy. That ain't